One evening in March of 1974, an investigator in Salt Lake City, Utah, sat across an interrogation table from a man who claimed he had psychic powers. Now, the investigator had naturally been quite skeptical of this man and his powers, but the man began giving him a bunch of very specific visions about the case the investigator was trying to solve. And in fact, some of the information he was revealing was enough to make the investigator wonder, could this man actually be a psychic? Or was he the killer? But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please go on an amazing vacation with the like button and volunteer to take pictures for them. But every time you take their picture, turn the camera around secretly and just take selfies of yourself. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On March 11th, 1974, 22-year-old Barbara Rockey sat at a desk in her bedroom in Provo, Utah, writing furiously. And as she was writing, eventually she paused for a minute to reread what she had written, but she wasn't quite happy yet, so she added a few more lines. The letter she was writing was for her roommates, and she knew it had to be perfect, because Barbara was saying goodbye. So Barbara was a junior at Brigham Young University, or BYU, which was a very religious school where most students were practicing Mormons, but not Barbara. She had chosen to go to BYU because of religion, but really just because she was fascinated by it and thought going to a school structured around faith would be very interesting. But when she actually got there, she immediately felt out of place because her classmates went to church every week for hours at a time, and they all followed a pretty strict set of behavioral rules and values, which wasn't really Barbara's thing. Barbara was from California and considered herself more of a free spirit who liked exploring new ideas and trying new things. So over the last 3 years, Barbara had felt both frustrated and also alienated by the other students' very rigid lifestyles. She'd been hoping that that would change with her new living situation. She'd just moved in with 7 other girls in January, but now, just 2 months into that, it was already very obvious that those girls did not like her. They were just as religious as the rest of the kids at BYU, and they seemed to think Barbara was weird for doing things like dating around and experimenting with different religions. It just didn't make sense to them. So Barbara had decided that instead of trying to change her roommates' minds, she would just lean into this kind of weird behavior, as they called it. Barbara basically started making them uncomfortable on purpose, like by saying she prayed to the devil, which totally shocked them. And after a while, Barbara had really got the sense that these girls, they weren't just weirded out by her. They were now actively scared of her, which really alienated Barbara a whole lot more. And so all of that was why Barbara was now writing this letter. She was telling her roommates that she was just going to go ahead and leave campus for a while to be with people that actually understood her. And the people she was thinking of were people like Richard Finder, a self-proclaimed psychic that Barbara had connected with after she'd called into a radio show where Richard had been giving psychic readings. And the two of them had connected immediately, because even though Richard was almost a decade older than her, he understood Barbara in a way that no one else in her life did. And ever since, they'd had this really intense relationship that felt both romantic and spiritual at the same time. But since Richard lived far away, most of their relationship so far had been over the phone. And so Barbara thought it might be nice to be physically closer to Richard and also his circle of friends. But there was another reason Barbara wanted to get away from BYU. And that was because she had started to feel unsafe being a young woman on a college campus. So recently there had been some scary national news stories about college women being attacked on campus. One student in Washington State had been beaten and almost killed in her dorm room in January, and another woman had gone missing the following month. And even though these attacks had not literally happened at BYU, it still freaked Barbara out. I mean, especially because these women who had been targeted just looked a lot like her physically, with long dark hair and sort of similar features. And so as a precaution, Barbara had been taking judo classes at school, and even got her best friend, Jerry Hicker, to help her buy a gun. Except Barbara had actually lost her gun recently. She'd not been able to find it for the last few weeks. She'd reported it missing to the campus police, but she really had no idea where it went. But for now, Barbara forgot about the gun and just took a deep breath and finished up her goodbye letter. Then she glanced over at the clock and saw it was almost 10 a.m., and so she had to get to class. So she grabbed the letter and put it inside of her purse, where she also was holding a turquoise necklace, which she planned to sell that day. It was the single most valuable thing that she owned, and she was going to pawn it to get some seed money to leave town. She'd figure out her actual destination based on how much she got for it. As Barbara threw her bag over her shoulder and got ready to leave, she heard a car pull into the driveway outside, which was a relief because she'd actually let her best friend Jerry borrow her car to go skiing the other day, and she had been hoping he would drop it off before she left for class, and so clearly that's what he was doing. And so Barbara hurried out her front door, and sure enough, there was her car, and there was Jerry climbing out and waving her keys, basically being like, "Hey, I'm back." As Jerry handed the car keys back over to Barbara, he asked her if they were still on for hanging out later. But Barbara was busy thinking about getting to class and the logistics of selling her necklace. She had decided that Salt Lake City would have more pawn shops that would pay better, and it was also less than an hour north. And so now that Jerry had dropped her car off, she could drive up there right after class. And so, Barbara just kind of nodded at Jerry and whatever he was saying, and then she took the keys, jumped in her car, and she was off. Over an hour later, Barbara was sitting in her social work class, waiting for the teacher to dismiss them. And as she was sitting there, she began to hear some students whispering behind her. And as they did, even though she couldn't quite hear what they were saying, she began to feel her face get red. Because even though she didn't know if they were talking about her, if they were, it certainly would not be the first time. People talked about her a lot. So Barbara just did her best to try to ignore them, and then as soon as the teacher said they could go, she jumped up and shoved her books into her bag. And then she hurried out of the building to where her car was parked, she got in, and pulled out of the lot. And as she made her way down the street, she actually felt a wave of excitement. She couldn't wait to sell this necklace and finally get out of this place. About 3 hours later, Barbara's best friend Jerry walked up the sidewalk to Barbara's house. He thought they had plans to meet up that afternoon, but Barbara never showed. And Barbara did not usually just blow off plans without calling, so now he was actually at her house just to make sure she was okay. And now Jerry noticed that her car was not in her driveway. So he just stood there for a minute, wondering if maybe he should go in and ask her roommates where she was. But he ultimately decided against it and just instead headed back to his place. But after beginning the walk back to his place, he passed by an apartment complex down the street from Barbara's place, and he stopped because he could clearly see Barbara's car parked in the lot, which was definitely out of the ordinary because Jerry was sure she did not know anybody who lived there. And so now, really starting to worry about Barbara, Jerry walked up to her car to check it out, and when he looked inside, he saw there was a note. And so he just opened up her car because he found it was unlocked, and he grabbed the note and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to pick up. An hour later, Jerry ran into the campus police station with Barbara's roommates following right behind him. After finding the note inside of Barbara's car, Jerry had gone back to Barbara's house to show it to her roommates and ask if they had seen her, because now he was worried that this note was some kind of suicide note. The note was a goodbye letter that Barbara apparently had written, and it said that she was leaving to be with her people, and the tone of it was just kind of alarming. Now, Jerry could tell her roommates thought that he was overreacting to this note, but they had ultimately agreed to come with him to the police to just make sure everything was okay. And so as soon as the officer on duty came out, Jerry explained to him that he had had plans with Barbara that day and she had not shown up, which was very uncharacteristic. And then he explained how he found her car and then also this letter and his concerns about this letter. And the officer on duty said, okay, we'll look into it. And so over the next few hours, the campus police did look into it. They reached out to some other kids on campus and also to Barbara's family, but nobody had seen or heard from Barbara since that morning. And so the police continued to look into this, realizing this could be a missing persons case, but technically not enough time had passed to officially call it that. So in this first day, it was all just kind of preliminary. The next day, almost 50 miles north of the BYU campus, a worker for a Utah utility company hiked up a trail in Big Cottonwood Canyon, a hilly nature preserve on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. Officially, he was there to check on some water lines, but he was also, taking his time and enjoying himself. This area was beautiful. It was high up in the mountains and very remote and peaceful. So this guy was genuinely shocked when he reached the top of the trail and saw he was not alone. there was a woman up there. But at first, the way his brain processed what he was seeing is he saw this woman who was lying on the ground and she appeared to be nude or partially nude, and he thought, oh, she's sunbathing, like that's what she's doing up here. But then he's like, it's March, it's cold, and she's face down, and she's definitely totally naked. And then he took a few more steps forward, and his brain kind of processed what he was seeing, at which point he just gasped, turned around, and ran back to his car to go alert the police. Within the hour, Captain Pete Hayward with the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office drove his cruiser along a remote access road that led to Big Cottonwood Canyon. So Hayward normally loved being in nature. All he really did in his spare time was hunt and fish. But right now, the scenery and remote location were actually kind of an inconvenience, because he needed to get to his destination quickly, and that was just very hard to do out here. Hayward had just gotten a call about a woman who had been found dead in the canyon by a worker for a utility company. And while a few responders were actually already there securing the scene, Hayward knew they wouldn't be able to really do anything until he got there. Because when he worked a murder case, every single detail had to go through him. A few minutes later, Hayward saw some police cars up ahead on the side of the road, and also a deputy waiting by a trailhead. And so he pulled over, got out, and then followed the deputy up a steep trail for about 300 yards. And he was pretty out of breath by the time he saw a few other crime scene techs and officers gathered around a bush, where underneath the bush there was a body of a naked woman lying face down on the ground. Hayward walked over and crouched down to examine the body. And right away he could see at least 3 bullet wounds in the woman's back. But other than that, he didn't see any other injuries, and there were no clear signs of decomposition. His best guess was that this woman had been there for maybe a day or so, which was actually sort of a miracle when he thought about it. I mean, this time of year, nobody came out to this area, and if it hadn't been for that utility worker, I mean, she might not have been found for months. Hayward looked next to the body, and he saw the woman's clothes and shoes were right nearby, and each item was actually folded very neatly, which struck him as a little bit strange. Hayward pulled on a glove and began examining the clothing, and he could see that there was really nothing ripped or damaged. And also, as Hayward kind of walked around the immediate area, he noticed the whole scene was just as neat as the clothes. There was no gun anywhere, and no marks in the dirt or signs of a struggle or a fight, and there was no indication that the body had been dragged around, and so Hayward felt pretty confident that this woman was likely shot and killed in the exact spot she was found in. Hayward stood in the middle of the trail and considered everything he was seeing. The neatly folded clothes could have been removed during consensual sex, and then maybe things turned violent, or they could mean the woman was maybe forced to undress at gunpoint. Either way, Hayward's gut told him that this woman's killer was someone she knew. Because the thing was, getting up here from the road was not easy. I mean, Hayward was pushing 50 and knew he was not in the best shape. But even for somebody who was young and fit, it would be hard to force another person all the way up a trail like this. It made more sense that this woman had first walked up willingly with someone she likely trusted, and then that person killed her once they were up there. But Hayward knew, his theory didn't mean much until he figured out who this woman was. She didn't seem to have a purse with her, and there was no ID in the pockets of her folded clothes. So Hayward waved some other officers over to help him flip her body over so they could look underneath her. And when they did that, Hayward saw there were a few bullets gathered in the dirt. They had clearly gone straight through this woman from the shots in her back. And so Hayward quickly told a tech to go ahead and photograph and bag the bullets for testing, and also to get some of the dirt that the bullets had been lodged in case there was some other evidence mixed in. So investigators in the 1970s did not rely on DNA yet, but they could test for things like clothing fibers or hairs and potentially connect that material to suspects. And so after giving his team their marching orders, Hayward took a deep breath and then headed back down the trail. He needed to go find this woman's name. The next day, Wednesday, March 13th, Hayward hustled down a hallway towards a meeting room at the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office. He was bleary-eyed and basically running on adrenaline because he'd been working this case non-stop since the day before. And he'd just come from a meeting with the ballistics expert who told him the gun that killed this woman was likely a .357 caliber. Now, this was obviously great for the investigation. However, a .357 was not particularly uncommon, so it didn't really narrow things down a whole bunch. However, Hayward had uncovered something that was major for the investigation, and that was the victim's identity. It was 22-year-old Barbara Rockey. So Hayward's team had put a broadcast out over the news the night before about the discovery of this body. And after they had put that out, they had gotten a call from the BYU police about a student of theirs who had gone missing a day earlier. And just a few hours ago, some of this missing student's classmates had come up to Salt Lake City to identify the body, and they had confirmed it was Barbara. Now, Hayward had spoken to some of those kids already, and he had some other officers contacting Barbara's family. But right now, Hayward was on his way to get a formal statement from a young man named Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the people who identified the body, and he was the first person to report Barbara missing. So Hayward was hoping he would have information that could point them towards Barbara's killer. Minutes later, Hayward sat down at a conference table across from Jerry, and from the looks of it, Jerry was very rattled. He kept shaking his head and looking away like he was trying not to cry, but Hayward was not a particularly gentle interviewer, so he didn't waste time with condolences or tissues, especially because Jerry was an obvious suspect. He was Barbara's closest friend at school, apparently, and Hayward was sure Barbara was killed by somebody she trusted. So he just bluntly told Jerry that he needed to know every single thing that happened on the day Barbara went missing. Jerry was sort of caught off guard by this level of bluntness, but he took a shaky breath and then explained how he'd borrowed Barbara's car the day before and then dropped it back off at her place on Monday morning around 10 a.m. And then he went to the library for a few hours. He then said he was supposed to meet up with Barbara. They had plans for later that day to hang out, but Barbara didn't show up. And when he went to her house to check on her car was gone, and so he began walking back home again when he actually saw her car down the block outside of an apartment complex that he didn't understand she would be at. Like, he didn't think she knew anybody who lived over there. And he said he walked up to the car, looked inside, and saw there was a note. He tried the door handle, it was open, he reached inside, got the note out, and he read it, and he said it was a pretty disturbing note. He thought it was maybe a suicide note. Hayward nodded. He had seen the note. The BYU police had given it to him. It did seem to be from Barbara, telling her roommates she was leaving town to be with people who she fit in with, but the note was kind of vague, and Hayward really wasn't sure what to make of it just yet. It could be a suicide note, or it could be something entirely ordinary. And the truth was, he wasn't actually even sure that Barbara had really written the letter. Maybe her killer had written the letter. Maybe whoever murdered Barbara was attempting to make her disappearance look like a suicide, or maybe imply that she had run away in the hopes that police would never find her body. And so Hayward had sent the letter off to a handwriting expert to see what they thought. Now, Hayward asked Jerry about his relationship with Barbara, and Jerry explained that the two of them hung out a ton, and she had gravitated towards him since she felt sort of unwelcome at school and around her roommates, who didn't really like her because she wasn't religious like they were. Jerry also told Hayward that Barbara had made the conflict with her roommates much worse by intentionally saying sacrilegious things in order to freak them out. So he said there was a lot of tension between them, and it had gotten so bad that at one point he had tried to find Barbara another place to live. This made Hayward perk up. Knowing that Barbara had a potential domestic conflict was an interesting lead. Even though a group of young, devout Mormon women were not necessarily obvious murder suspects, it was definitely worth looking into. Maybe one of them had been so horrified and outraged by Barbara's teasing that they'd snapped and tried to hurt her. Hayward didn't have any other questions for Jerry, so he stood up and told him he could go. He wasn't ready to eliminate anybody as a suspect just yet, but so far, Jerry seemed pretty unlikely. He had an alibi, and he was also the one who reported Barbara missing. And considering it was complete luck that her body was even found at all in the area that it was, it really would have been in the killer's best interest to keep quiet and hope her body was never found. So why would Jerry go to police at all if he was the killer? So Hayward headed out the door to wrangle some officers. They needed to go to Provo and have another word with Barbara's roommates. The next afternoon, just 2 days after Barbara was found in the canyon, Hayward pulled up to a pawn shop on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. If he thought he was tired yesterday, well, he was absolutely exhausted now, because a lot had happened in the last 24 hours. They'd gotten in touch with Barbara's family, who were obviously shocked and devastated, but they didn't have any useful information for the investigation. They didn't know much about Barbara's friends or life at school, so they couldn't say if anybody would have wanted to hurt her. And they'd had no idea if she had been planning to leave campus for any reason. But apparently, she was, because the handwriting expert had come back and confirmed the note was authentic, and Barbara did write it. So her plans to leave appeared to be genuine, which is what the note basically was about, if you read it literally. But for Hayward, after speaking to Jerry, who talked about the tension between Barbara and her roommates and how she didn't fit in, and also after Hayward literally spoke to all 7 of Barbara's roommates, and they all actually admitted they did not like Barbara, it made Hayward think that the letter from Barbara should be interpreted literally, that she was just trying to flee campus and get away, in particular from her roommates. But the roommates all had solid alibis for the day Barbara went missing. So for now, Hayward basically had to rule out the roommates. But Hayward was not that upset about this, because the roommates had actually given him another lead. According to one of the roommates, right before Barbara had disappeared, she had mentioned that she planned to pawn a turquoise necklace that she owned in Salt Lake City. So Hayward and some other officers had spent the whole day canvassing pawn shops in that area to see if maybe she had actually gone through with it. Now, so far, Hayward had not found the necklace or, found the pawn shop that maybe Barbara went to, but he was very hopeful, maybe too hopeful in some ways. Because, aside from this necklace lead, the investigation really was kind of losing steam. They had searched and fingerprinted Barbara's car, but had not found anything significant. They'd also gotten the autopsy back, and it was mostly unhelpful. The medical examiner had actually counted 5 gunshot wounds, not just 3, so more than Hayward had thought, but they couldn't confirm whether or not Barbara was sexually assaulted. And also, the forensics report had come back, and they had not been able to collect any fingerprints at the scene. And so all of this was swirling around in Hayward's head as he stepped into this particular pawn shop, and he asked the woman behind the counter if they had recently purchased a turquoise necklace. And to his shock, the woman said yes. And then she gestured towards a glass case behind the counter where Hayward could see a long white necklace lined with turquoise stones on a red felt pad. About a half an hour later, Hayward was back behind the wheel of his cruiser, and his heart was pounding and his mind was racing so fast he could barely pay attention to the road, because Hayward finally had a real trail here. The shop clerk's description of the person who had sold that turquoise necklace matched Barbara perfectly. Not only that, the shopkeeper also had a receipt for the sale that showed Barbara was at the store on March 11th at 12:50 p.m., the same day she went missing. But the most incredible part of this new lead was that Barbara had apparently told this clerk that she was in a hurry because her boyfriend was circling the block outside. And this was huge because Hayward and his team had spoken to a lot of people in Barbara's life, and no one had mentioned a boyfriend. Now, unfortunately, the pawn shop worker had not gotten a look at this person, this boyfriend that Barbara was talking about. So Hayward had just taken the necklace and the receipt for evidence, and now he was rushing back to the precinct to make some calls. He needed to see if anybody in Barbara's life knew about this boyfriend and maybe had just failed to mention it for some reason. But as soon as Hayward parked and hurried inside the precinct, he was stopped by a deputy, and this deputy seemed as excited and frazzled as Hayward felt. The deputy told Hayward that he wasn't going to believe this, but they had been continuing their background interviews, and some of Barbara's friends said that Barbara had mentioned a boyfriend named Richard. This was great news for Hayward. I mean, he was literally looking for exactly this information. But this actually was not the reason why the deputy was so worked up, just the fact that she had a boyfriend. He explained that Richard was Richard Finder, a supposed psychic from California who just happened to be in town on a ski vacation at the same time Barbara was killed. And the reason they knew that was because Richard had just called the station completely out of the blue and offered to help. A few hours later, Hayward sat down across an interrogation table from 30-year-old Richard Finder. Richard had on glasses and he had a goatee, and he seemed very confident and also quite eager to help. But to Hayward, he just felt like he was putting on an act. He felt certain that Richard had to be Barbara's killer. After all, it actually was not unusual for murderers to actually insert themselves into the murder investigation, to sort of, see what's going on and maybe deflect blame away from themselves. And so for Hayward, he felt like that was exactly what Richard was doing, calling in to offer up his supposed psychic services. But also, Hayward had spent the last couple of hours digging into Richard, and he also discovered that he owned a .357 pistol, the same kind of gun that had killed Barbara. And on top of that, he found out the place where Richard was staying was in Salt Lake City, very close to Big Cottonwood Canyon, where Barbara's body was found. It was just too many coincidences, and so Hayward was prepared to get extremely tough with Richard to get a confession. But Hayward got a few of his background questions out of the way first. And after asking Richard how he knew Barbara, Richard explained that they had connected after she had heard him speak on the radio. And he said that they'd actually never been physical, but they'd had a deep spiritual relationship. After that, Hayward cut to the chase and just asked Richard point blank why he had called the station. And at that point, Richard became very serious and said that he needed to come forward because he had a feeling about what had happened to Barbara. He said, he was a psychic, and he had a vision that the gun, the murder weapon, had been thrown in some water somewhere. Hayward couldn't believe what he was hearing, because, the police had not announced the murder weapon was missing. Richard shouldn't have known they were looking for the murder weapon, but clearly he did. So at this point, Hayward did not ask more questions about what his vision said. Instead, he demanded that Richard account for every single hour of his day on Monday, March 11th, the day that Barbara went missing. And for the first time, Richard actually seemed genuinely thrown off. He just sort of stared back at Hayward in what seemed to be complete shock, and then he said he didn't kill Barbara. He said he couldn't have. He was with his friends the whole day. Hayward just kind of glared at Richard and then slid a pad of paper over to him to write down his friend's information so they could follow up. And as he watched Richard hurry to jot down some names and numbers, Hayward felt sure this was their guy. There was just a mountain of circumstantial evidence here against him. But he knew they needed something more concrete to actually make an arrest. So Hayward first would have to check out Richard's alibi, and then also test Richard's personal gun, his .357, against the bullets that had killed Barbara. So he told Richard that for now he could go, but they would need to take a look at his gun. A few weeks later, Hayward sat at his desk in the sheriff's office staring at some ballistics results from Richard's gun. And it would turn out it was definitely not the gun that killed Barbara. And Hayward literally couldn't remember a time when he'd been more, frankly, shocked and disappointed. I mean, he really had Richard pegged as the killer. Richard basically was his only suspect, and he was a great one, especially since they had checked on his alibi and it didn't really hold up. The friends he said he was with that whole day actually said, well, we were with him, but not the whole day. So basically, there were large chunks of time on the day she went missing when Richard was unaccounted for. Hayward sighed and reminded himself that, just because the gun he owned wasn't a match, it didn't mean Richard was innocent. I mean, it's possible he used a different .357 and then just ditched the weapon. Still though, Hayward couldn't believe they were back to square one like this. He felt like he had done everything he could at this point. He talked to who he needed to talk to, he'd analyzed the evidence they'd gotten, and he had really nothing to show for it. Hayward was used to closing cases and giving families the answers they wanted. And now he was worried he was not going to be able to do that. And sure enough, over the coming months and then years, Hayward did continue to investigate this case, but the leads got fewer and fewer, and then eventually he got promoted, and then before long he was pulled into other cases, and eventually Barbara's case just went cold. In the fall of 2005, so over 25 years after Barbara's murder, Detective Todd Park sat on the floor by his desk in the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department. Around him on the floor, it was covered with crime scene photos and interviews and evidence logs from the 1974 investigation of Barbara Rocky's murder. Park was a brand new homicide detective, and he had taken on this case after getting a call from one of Barbara's sisters, begging the sheriff's office to reopen it. And Park wasn't sure if it was maybe just new guy enthusiasm, but he was already pretty obsessed with trying to solve it. He really wanted to find some answers for the Rocky family, since they'd been wondering what happened to Barbara for now over 2 decades. And Park actually felt pretty optimistic about it, because even though during the original investigation, They hadn't relied on DNA testing. They couldn't really even do DNA testing. Despite that, the investigators at the time had done a rape kit and saved all the evidence from the scene, like Barbara's clothes and even the dirt that was underneath her body, which meant that with the current advancements in DNA technology, there was a good chance they could actually solve this thing. Park had already sent a few items over for testing, but while he waited for the results, he was going over the details of the case to get a sense of how it was investigated back in 1974. And he found it was a pretty unusual case. The murder had initially been investigated as a personally motivated crime. But while the case was cold, police had also begun to consider the idea that maybe Barbara had been murdered by the notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy. This was not personal, that she was just one of many victims. Ted Bundy had been arrested less than an hour away from where Barbara lived in Salt Lake City in 1975, just 1 year after her murder. And he had been killing college women all over the West Coast, including several in Utah, the same year Barbara was killed. But investigators in the late 1970s had ruled Ted Bundy out after determining he'd been committing a different murder in Washington state at the same time Barbara was killed, so he could not have been her killer. But it was still possible that Barbara had been killed by a different serial killer in the area. 1974 is notoriously known as the Year of Fear because there were so many killers operating in the United States at that time. But as Park read through the notes, he found himself agreeing with the original investigators' first instincts, that Barbara's murder must have been personal. Also, just the amount of times Barbara was shot seemed emotionally charged. And so Park believed Barbara's boyfriend, Richard Finder, had to be the killer. I mean, after all, Richard had been in the area at the time of the murder. He basically had no alibi. And, he brought up the fact that there was a missing murder weapon when the public didn't even know that. So he knows things about the crime scene that he shouldn't know. But Park felt like there were some other people in this case that also deserved a second look, like Barbara's best friend, Jerry Hicker. It was true he did have an alibi, and Barbara had told that pawn shop owner, before she was killed, that she was with her boyfriend, which she would not have referred to Jerry as. But if this was as emotional a crime as Park thought it was, Jerry had to be considered. After all, he was Barbara's closest friend at school, and maybe he heard she was leaving town and got mad at her. And then Barbara's roommates, they all seemed to have solid alibis, but maybe one of them had gotten somebody else to kill Barbara. Park knew the original investigators hadn't found any evidence of that, but they also hadn't seemed to spend much time on the roommates one way or another. They just kind of quickly ruled them out. But Park also knew it could be someone that they hadn't even considered yet, like the utility worker who actually found the body, or maybe another student at BYU who didn't like Barbara and considered her an outsider or a weirdo. Park wasn't sure yet, but he was confident that they'd be able to pick up some DNA somewhere in the evidence, and once they did, they'd find their killer. Two years later, on an afternoon in October of 2007, Park paced around his office and periodically stopped to look at the phone on his desk. He was waiting for a call from the lab, and with each passing moment, he got more and more anxious. So at this point in Park's re-investigation of Barbara's murder, the DNA testing had basically gotten them nowhere. Over the last 2 years, the medical lab had gone over almost every single item from Barbara's case, like her rape kit swabs and her clothes. But they hadn't been able to get any DNA from anything. It either wasn't there, or was just too old and not preserved well enough. And so the only thing left to test was the dirt that the original investigators collected from underneath Barbara's body. Park actually had not originally sent in the dirt because he didn't think it would have any DNA inside of it. But it was now the only piece of evidence that he had left. So Park knew that when the lab called this time, he'd either be on his way to finding the killer's name, or his case would basically be over. But then Park's phone finally rang. He immediately picked it up, and his mouth went dry when he heard it was the lab on the other end. And before Park could even ask them, they told him they had a profile. They'd been able to find traces of DNA in that dirt sample taken from under Barbara's body. And when Park finally got his hands on that DNA profile and he ran it through their criminal database, he got a name. Based on DNA evidence and a decades-long investigation, Here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Barbara Rockey on March 11, 1974. Just before noon, the killer watched Barbara pull up to the sidewalk in her car. The killer immediately walked over and jumped inside and smiled at Barbara, and she smiled right back. And together, they drove to the pawn shop in Salt Lake City that Barbara wanted to go to. When they got there, Barbara hopped out of the car and went inside. And once she was inside, the killer moved over to the driver's seat, and so they basically were going to drive the car from that point forward. And as the killer sat in the driver's seat waiting for Barbara, their heart was racing. They couldn't wait for her to get back outside and get in the car because the killer was in love with her, and they had decided that today they were finally going to make their relationship physical. So when Barbara came outside and hopped in the passenger seat of the car after selling her necklace, the killer very excitedly turned to her and said, "Hey, there's some trails nearby. Why don't we go for a hike?" Barbara clearly hesitated, like she didn't really want to do this. But the killer knew Barbara was leaving Utah, and they knew she had written a goodbye note and was selling the necklace for funds to leave for good, so they kind of guilt-tripped her. They said, "Look, let's go enjoy the beautiful countryside before you leave town." Barbara shrugged and said, "Okay, fine." And so the killer very excitedly drove the car over to the canyon and parked near a picnic area. Then the two of them got out, and as they began walking towards the trail, the killer reached down and touched the outside of their pocket, just to make sure the gun that they had stolen from Barbara was still there. Now, they didn't know if they were going to use the gun or not, but they just wanted to make sure it was there and ready. And so for a while, the killer and Barbara just hiked along this trail, just chatting and making their way up and enjoying the scenery. But at some point, the killer they couldn't wait any longer. They had to make their move. And so they stopped Barbara, and the killer, after making sure nobody else was around, they moved forward and kind of made their move. They touched Barbara in a way that was very clearly meant to be romantic. But immediately Barbara kind of recoiled and jumped back and told the killer that she didn't want that, which immediately made the killer incredibly angry. And so the killer stepped towards her again and could see Barbara had this alarmed look on her face, which made them even more angry. So they pulled out Barbara's gun and they aimed it at her and then told her to take off her clothes. And Barbara, she was horrified, but she did as she was told, but she intentionally was taking her time. As she took off a piece of clothing, she would painstakingly fold it very neatly, all the while begging the killer not to do this. And then after taking off all of her clothes and stacking them next to her, she continued to plead with the killer. The killer was so humiliated and so angry that they decided enough was enough. And they shot Barbara right in the chest. And she crumpled to the ground, and they fired wildly several more times until Barbara went still. And then once Barbara was either dead or dying on the ground, the killer just panicked and turned and ran back down the trail, back to Barbara's car. They hopped in and they drove back to Provo and the BYU campus. But on the way there, they stopped and ditched Barbara's purse and the gun. And then when they actually got to Provo, the reason they parked Barbara's car down the road near that other apartment complex was so that when the killer got out of the car, Barbara's 7 roommates would not see them doing so. Then they fled, leaving Barbara's note in the car. Barbara's note was not a suicide note. It was a literal goodbye note that she had written for her roommates. But the killer figured it sort of seemed like a suicide note, so if they left it here, when they came back to find the car and find the note inside of it, they could tell the police that this seems like maybe Barbara has killed herself. It would send the police in a direction that would hopefully not lead back to the killer. It would turn out Barbara's killer was her best friend, Jerry Hicker. The original investigators didn't suspect Jerry at first, mainly because of his cooperation, and since he was the one who also first reported her missing. But they did begin to get suspicious of him when he eventually revealed his violent streak. The year after he killed Barbara, he was connected to a few different rape cases on campus. But they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest until decades later when the lab finally found DNA in the soil from the 1974 crime scene. They were able to match that profile to Jerry's DNA, which they had on file from his involvement in another unrelated crime. And so ultimately, Jerry killed Barbara with her own gun, which he had helped her buy so she could protect herself from killers just like him. By the time Jerry was arrested in 2007, he was dying of cancer. He confessed to Barbara's murder for a reduced sentence and served 5 years before he was released. He died in 2014. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you about a mystery that is both incredibly haunting and incredibly weird. There are so many clues and pieces of evidence in this mystery, but they all basically point in different directions, or in some cases, literally defy the laws of physics. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice tasty dessert, a mud pie. But don't tell them you're using real mud. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 1 a.m. on May 16, 2006, a 35-year-old woman named Allison Rivera bolted upright suddenly in her bed in her home in Baltimore, Maryland. Her home security alarm was blaring. But even though that was obviously pretty surprising, it didn't really surprise her, because the alarm had gone off at almost the exact same time the night before. And so now, in the dark, Allison could see the shape of her husband, Ray, as he grabbed a baseball bat, and then Ray rushed out of the room and down the stairs he went, and Allison quickly trailed right behind him. And when the two of them got downstairs near the alarm still going off, they flipped on the lights and they looked around, but Allison didn't see anybody inside of their house, and all the doors were shut. But when she looked at one specific window, she saw it was just slightly open. And again, this didn't totally surprise her, because the previous night when their alarm had gone off, they had gotten in touch with the police, and the police had looked around, and even though they didn't find anybody, they discovered that that particular window that was currently open slightly had been tampered with the night before, which set off the alarm, and it apparently had happened again tonight. But the police didn't think this was an attempted break-in. They said the alarm had probably been set off by a squirrel. Now, at the time, Allison and Ray had, thought that was pretty crazy that a squirrel had set off the alarm here, but it seemed plausible, and the police seemed pretty certain of it, and so they had accepted it and just gone back to bed after, turning off the alarm and shutting the window again. But now, 24 hours later, to be standing in their house, the alarm's going off, and clearly this window has been lifted up again, it just seemed weird that a squirrel's doing this? That just seems far-fetched. Something's off here. And so Allison and Ray, they couldn't help but feel like maybe the police were wrong. Maybe this is an attempted break-in by a person, not a squirrel. In fact, Allison had this nagging fear about what was maybe going on here that she couldn't shake. She wondered if someone might be out to get her husband, Ray. Ray and Allison had recently moved to Baltimore because Ray had gotten a job at this financial investment firm called Stansberry & Associates that was in the city. Ray's actual job was to write the firm's email newsletter, which gave advice to subscribers about buying and selling stocks. But Ray didn't actually know anything about investing. His background was in screenwriting and freelance videography, not finance. And the only reason he'd gotten the job was because one of his friends owned the company and had basically hired him as a favor. So even though Ray was sort of trying his best here, some of the advice that he was pumping out in this newsletter was terrible, and people had very likely lost money because of it. So it felt possible that maybe one of these disgruntled subscribers could have found Allison and Ray's address and was now trying to get even with Ray. But even though this seemed plausible, that theory was kind of wild and conspiratorial, and so on this night, Allison didn't say anything about these fears to Ray. Instead, she just went over and turned off the alarm while Ray did a sweep of the house and then also made sure this window was firmly shut. And then afterward, Allison asked Ray if maybe they should call the police again. But, Ray just said no. He said, very likely it was just a squirrel like the police said, and so the house is safe, we're okay, let's just go to bed. And so even though Allison felt pretty uneasy here, she said okay, and the two of them went back to bed. Early the next morning, Allison sat at the dining room table and quickly ate the breakfast that Ray had made for her. She was leaving that morning for a business trip 3 hours away in Virginia, and she needed to get on the road. So after finishing her food, she put her plate in the sink, and then Ray carried her suitcase out to her car for her, and then she and Ray exchanged I love yous, and then Allison got into the car and drove off, waving at Ray as she left. 3 hours later, Allison made it to Virginia. She would spend the entire day working, and then finally at about 6:30 p.m., she checked into the hotel where she was staying. By this point, Allison was so exhausted that she practically collapsed onto the hotel bed. All she wanted to do was just check in with Ray, watch a little TV, and go to sleep. So she took out her phone and she called him. It rang a few times, but just went to voicemail. So Allison waited and then tried again. But the same thing happened, which was odd. Allison wondered if Ray wasn't picking up because something had come up with work or maybe family. I mean, normally he would answer, and certainly he'd be expecting a call from her around this time. But fortunately, one of Allison's colleagues, whose name was Claudia, was actually staying with them in Baltimore. She was traveling through the area, and so that night, she was going to be there with Ray. So Allison called Claudia, who did pick up, and she asked Claudia if Ray was around. And what Claudia said was pretty surprising. She said a couple hours earlier, so between 5 and 6 o'clock, Ray had been at the house. He'd been doing something on his computer down the hall from the guest room where Claudia was staying. And from the guest room, Claudia said she heard Ray's cell phone ring. He picked up the call, and a few seconds later, he said, quote, "Oh shit." Then Ray, literally, according to Claudia, sprinted out of the house. Claudia heard him climb into his car, and he peeled out of the neighborhood. Claudia said she had no idea where he'd gone, and he still was not back. Now, obviously, Allison was confused when she heard this, but she did not immediately panic. She figured that whatever had sent Ray running out of the house was probably just an emergency with work or friends or family, which, could be bad, but she assumed Ray would call her back and explain everything as soon as he got a chance. And so Allison thanked Claudia, doing her best not to give off any vibes that she was worried, and then she hung up and began getting ready for bed. The whole time, Allison is watching her phone, waiting for what she is sure will be a call from Ray. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., Allison woke up to the sound of her phone finally ringing. She felt this immediate jolt of hope that it was Ray calling to explain what was going on, but when she looked at the face of her phone, she saw it was actually Claudia calling. But she figured, okay, maybe Claudia is with Ray and she has an update that everything's fine and that this is all going to be explained. And so Allison picked up and she goes, "Hey, Claudia, is my husband back? Is everything okay?" And Claudia said, "Your husband has not come home yet. I have no idea what's going on with him. But I have to leave. I have to go to the airport." At this point, Allison couldn't even hide her worry in her voice. I mean, she basically was completely panic-stricken. What was going on with Ray? It was completely unlike him to stay out all night, miss her calls, and still not be home. Like, she had no idea what was going on here. So she told Claudia, who at this point is basically saying, "Do you want me to stay and wait for your husband?" She was sort of insinuating this. Allison told Claudia, "Go ahead, go to the airport, do your thing. I'm going to cancel my work trip. I'm coming home. I got to figure out what's going on with Ray." As soon as Allison was off the phone, she packed up her stuff, she checked out at the hotel, and began the 3-hour drive back to Baltimore. As she drove, she did her best to stay calm, but, she's calling Ray's cell phone basically the whole time, over and over and over again, and he wasn't answering. And then eventually, when she would call, it wouldn't even ring. It would just go straight to voicemail, suggesting that his phone was turned off or maybe, had died. And at that point, Allison really couldn't control her panic. I mean, she knew something's wrong here. She had this theory that had something to do with her husband. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence. It just felt like something bad has happened here, and she had no idea what it was. And so Allison spent the rest of the drive frantically calling Ray's workplace, his friends, his family, asking everybody if they had heard from him or if they had called him and said something that freaked him out the previous evening, anything. But everyone she spoke to said they had not seen or heard from Ray. When Allison finally pulled onto her street, she had this hope, this small hope that she would get home and Ray's car would be there and Ray would be inside and he'd have a story that would explain this whole crazy thing. But no, She got there, his car was gone, the house is empty, and she just knew something is definitely wrong. And so she turned right around and drove to the police station. However, when Allison reported her husband was missing to the police, it was immediately clear to her that the police were not really that concerned. Ray was an adult who had apparently left the house of his own volition. He also hadn't even been gone for a full 24 hours yet. So the police took down Allison's report, and they did tell her they would look for him. But she just felt like they were not nearly as concerned as she was. But Allison and Ray's friends and family were definitely concerned. And over the next few days, they flocked to Baltimore to support Allison and also to help look for Ray. They drove all around the city, literally looking for Ray, but they didn't see any sign of him anywhere. They called local hospitals and asked about any John Does who maybe had come in, but none of them matched Ray's description. They also checked Ray's bank records, but he hadn't used any of his cards since he had disappeared. And as days passed with no new information and no new updates from police, Allison only got more and more desperate. And so finally, one afternoon, a couple of days after Ray first went missing, she just started looking through her own house, looking for any clues about where Ray had gone. And eventually, when she was in that room where Ray had been on his computer, when Claudia had heard him, swear into the phone and bolt out of the house, in that room at Ray's desk, she did find something strange. It was this piece of paper that was folded up really small, and it was wrapped in plastic, and it was taped to the back of his computer monitor. And so Allison peeled off the tape, she opened up the bag, and she unwrapped the paper. And what she found is it was a typed letter addressed to, quote, brothers and sisters. And then the actual contents of this letter made absolutely no sense. It referenced some kind of secret society called the Council. It talked about secrets and some kind of game, and it also contained 3 lists. One with technologies like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. There was one with a bunch of movie titles that seemed to be completely random. And also there was one with names of real people, but they included celebrities and also some of Ray's family members. Now, to any random person, this note would have probably looked pretty unhinged, maybe even like a possible manifestation of serious mental illness. But to Allison, it actually didn't read that way. She knew Ray was very interested in conspiracies and secret societies from a creative standpoint. And so after a brief moment of confusion when she first read this thing, she decided, maybe this document was him collecting ideas for a new screenplay. It wouldn't have surprised her at all if he was trying to write a script about the Council, whatever that was. But what did surprise Allison was the way this letter was printed, folded up, and then taped to the computer. It just seemed so weird. So Allison actually took the note to the police station and handed it over to the officer in charge of Ray's case. The officer took it as evidence and said they'd be in touch with her about it. But they weren't in touch. And more days went by and Ray didn't show up and there were no updates from police, and so Allison really didn't know what to do. But then on May 22nd, so 6 days after Ray disappeared, Allison was at home when she got her call from her parents. They said they'd been driving around the city looking for Ray, and they had found something. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Heaviness in your life doesn't usually announce itself. Typically, it just sort of hits you. For example, when I left the military and had to reintegrate back into civilian life, that meant I was leaving behind a clear mission, I was leaving behind tight-knit bonds and an identity that was built on service and purpose, while I was also trying to find my place in a world that felt very unfamiliar. And so this made me carry this really deep emotional weight that I was not expecting. Now, at the time, I kind of told myself that feeling, that heaviness inside of me, that it would just sort of pass with time. Once I get situated as a civilian, it'll just go away. But it didn't. And eventually, I began to wonder, why am I still struggling with this? Why do I still feel this really intense weight on me? Well, the reason for that is emotional weight does not just disappear because your life moves on. It stays with you unless you deal with it. That heaviness, it's not like a symbol of a failure in your life. In reality, it's just your brain holding on to what at one point was keeping you safe. Now, if you're feeling this way, having some awareness around this definitely helps. But untangling it, getting this weight sort of off your shoulders,
often requires someone trained to help you let it go. The new year is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about finding support that helps you feel lighter moving forward. A great starting point for anybody who thinks they could use this type of service is BetterHelp. With over 30,000 licensed therapists, you'll have access to a diverse community of professionals across different specialties, backgrounds, and locations. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month and take a step toward feeling lighter in 2026. A few minutes later, Allison skidded into a parking lot in downtown Baltimore and parked her car right next to her parents' car. The area was swarming with police officers and news vans, and through this chaotic crowd, Allison could see what they were all looking at. It was Ray's car. And so Allison jumped out of her vehicle and she ran to the nearest police officer and she asked them what was going on. And they told her, after Allison's parents had called her about Ray's car, that was the thing they had found, they'd called the police, and officers had come to investigate. And they discovered that Ray's car had a parking ticket on the windshield that showed it had been parked in this lot for 6 days, so since the evening of May 16th, which meant Ray's car had been right here since the night he'd gone missing, which was May 16th. The officer told her that none of Ray's belongings, like his phone or his money clip, were inside the vehicle, and there was no sign of a break-in, so they weren't stolen from the vehicle. So on the surface, it appeared that on the night Ray went missing, he'd driven here, parked in this lot, gotten out, but after that, nobody knows what happened. This discovery sent Allison's fear and panic to a whole new level, and it also seemed to make the police and the public take Ray's disappearance much more seriously. All of a sudden, people all over the city were looking for Ray. And 2 days later, on May 24th, so this is 8 days into Ray's disappearance, a volunteer search party decided to go onto the roof of a downtown parking garage to get a better view of the city to help with their search for Ray. When they got up there, they saw something that, if it had to do with Ray, it was very dark, and so they called the police. Adjacent to this parking garage was a historic building called the Belvedere. It used to be a hotel, but now it was just a condo complex. The Belvedere, at its highest point, was 13 stories high. But it also had a smaller section that was still a part of the Belvedere that was just 2 stories high, and they kind of butted up against the 13-story section. From the top of the parking garage where the search party was, they could see the Belvedere, of course, but they could also look down and see the roof of the smaller section of the Belvedere. They could see the very top of that building. And on the roof, they saw 4 things: a pair of flip-flops, a pair of glasses, a cell phone, and a very obvious hole in the roof. Within the hour, a detective named Michael Bayer and a team of Baltimore PD officers followed a concierge down the hallway of the Belvedere Hotel building. When Detective Bayer and his team had arrived, they'd asked the building staff about a hole in the roof of that 2-story section of the Belvedere, but none of them knew what the police were talking about. The employees said that 2-story section of the hotel where the hole apparently was closed off and had been for a long time, so nobody, at least none of them, had gone over there, not anytime recently, and so they really couldn't speak to there being a hole or not. It was possible, but nobody knew. And on top of that, nobody, not staff or guests, had reported seeing or hearing anything strange in the last week and a half, so there was no indication that damage had been done really anywhere in the hotel. But now, the concierge led Detective Bayer and his team down several winding hallways and through a series of locked doors until eventually they reached the room that corresponded to where the hole in the roof was. And as soon as the concierge unlocked that door that would lead into that room, Detective Bayer and his team were hit by a horrible smell. They went inside to this big, large, empty room that looked like it once had been a conference room, and daylight was streaming down through the hole in the roof. And the light was shining directly on Ray Rivero's body. Ray was lying on the floor, face up, surrounded by dried blood, and his body was mangled. One of his legs had been broken so badly that the bones were sticking up at odd angles, and he was very badly decomposed, and so obviously was responsible for the smell. At first glance, Detective Bayer is looking at Ray's body, he's looking at the roof, and he's thinking, okay, clearly Ray, fell through the roof down here. That's how he's got here. He came through the roof. But when police examined the hole, and also those items that the search party had literally seen from their vantage point on the roof, the glasses, the flip-flops, and the cell phone, and then also when they did an autopsy on Ray's body, they realized that it actually was physically impossible for Ray to have come through the hole into this room. Because there were only 3 possible places that Ray could have fallen or jumped from to land on the Belvedere's roof where the hole was. And none of them made sense when compared to the evidence that police had. The first possibility was that Ray had fallen or jumped from the very top of the Belvedere, which is 13 stories tall. A fall from that height would definitely have killed him and caused the devastating injuries found in the autopsy, like broken legs, a broken skull, broken ribs. But the edge of the 13th story roof was 45 feet away horizontally from the hole in the second story roof. And so from a physics perspective, it was basically impossible that Ray could have somehow gone fast enough and then leapt off the roof as fast and as far as he could, that he could have carried himself 45 feet forward before plummeting down and hitting the roof. That's just too far of a distance for a person to jump. The second possibility was that Ray maybe had gone off of a thin decorative ledge that wrapped around the outside of the Belvedere on the 11th floor. If Ray fell from there, he could have landed in the spot where the hole was. However, that ledge was impossible to access without first going through a privately owned condo or office. Ray would have had to be physically let in, but again, nobody in any part of the building had reported seeing or interacting with him. And the third possibility was that Ray had gone off the top of that same parking garage that the search party had been at. It was close enough horizontally that, Ray could have landed in the spot where the hole was. But the very top of that parking garage was only about 20 feet above the second story roof of the Belvedere, which was obviously enough of a height to fall to have serious damage done to your body, but that's not enough of a fall to cause the extreme injuries that were found on Ray's body. It just wasn't enough. And then to make this whole situation even stranger, when police examined those items that were found on the roof, Ray's flip-flops, his glasses, and cell phone, they found that all the items were not, helter-skelter, sort of cast around as if he blasted through the roof and everything fell off of him. No, they were sort of organized, placed neatly on the roof like they had been staged on purpose. And also, Ray's glasses and phone were not damaged at all. So it just sort of begged the question, how could this have happened? How did he fall in the first place? How did he wind up in this room? But even if you identify where he fell from or how he fell, how did his belongings wind up placed so neatly on the roof like that without any damage? It just didn't add up. And so the police didn't know what to make of any of this. And so they turned their attention back to a totally different piece of evidence. That weird note that Allison had found taped to the back of Ray's computer in their home. And so they sent that note to the FBI for analysis, hoping it would tell them something. And it did. The FBI said that, based on the note, Ray was likely mentally ill and experiencing some kind of psychotic episode. This was not like a screenplay, this was, manifestation of something off in his mind. And the police, this didn't really answer all their questions, but it was sort of a relief. It seemed like, this sort of generally answers a very complicated and confusing situation. Basically, this was enough for the Baltimore PD to stop investigating, although they didn't actually officially close the case, and tell Ray's wife, Allison, and her family that Ray's death, as bizarre as it is, even though we don't really know how it happened, what we do know is that it most likely was a suicide. But Allison was not satisfied with this explanation. Because one, it still didn't answer the question of where Ray had fallen from. That seemed like an important thing to answer. And two, she didn't think Ray was mentally ill, and she was certain he had not killed himself. Allison's theory was that her husband was murdered, very likely because of his job. Here he is parading around like he's got great investment advice and he's pumping out his tips into that newsletter that she knows and he knows are basically fraudulent. He doesn't know anything about investing. The opportunity to basically screw over subscribers was pretty high. People are taking his advice and they could be losing money because of it. And so it seemed entirely possible that somebody who was disgruntled over his bad advice came after him. And then also adding to the idea that like this was not, self-harm, that something bad happened to Ray from an outside source, there was that strange phone call that Claudia, the friend, overheard him have when he said, "Oh shit," and then ran out the house. The police were able to trace that particular call back to Stansberry and Associates, the investment firm where Ray worked, but they were never able to figure out who had placed it or why. Because as soon as detectives began asking questions of this firm, well, Stansberry and Associates hired attorneys and told its employees not to speak about what happened to anyone, not even the police. And so to this day, Ray's case remains officially unsolved. But somewhere out there is the person who placed that final phone call to Ray. This person must know why Ray ran out of his house in a panic that night, and they might even know how he died or who killed him. But as of now, that person has not come forward. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.